Dear friends, most welcome to the 16th program of the season 2 of ASHA, that is Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, and Ganga Jamni Heritage online series. As all of you know, that our aim is dissemination of knowledge of our past based on secular and scientific approach. Since decades, our understanding of the past has been vitiated by the attempts being made time and again to manipulate our history by using all type of means, including archaeological data and structural remains. Since at least a century, a particular medieval monument was at the center of contested history. It was forcibly demolished in 1992, and then by 2003, our courts summoned the Archaeological Survey of India to determine through excavations whether the demolished mosque was constructed on the site of a demolished temple or not. A very hurried court-sponsored excavations took place. A half-baked report, which was used by the highest court in India to adjudicate the ongoing dispute, was drafted. It was never published. The Supreme Court, while rejecting the ASI excavations, gave the green signal for a temple to come up at the site. Secondly, since long, another attempt was made, again with the help of Archaeological Survey of India, to somehow prove the existence of a mythical river, and an attempt to reinterpret the Indus Valley civilization known throughout the world as such, and attempts were made to reinterpret it as Indus Saraswati civilization. More recently, the UGC has also proposed a new syllabus of history where this attempt is being tried to be further strengthened and popularized. The Archaeological Survey of India, which had been founded in 1861 and which, to its credit, had upheld high credentials of scientific approach, not only within India but even outside, was soon turned into a handmaiden of chauvinistic politics. Today, we are going to deal with a book which deals with how this came to pass, and I am mentioning this book to you, Bureaucratic Archaeology. A reading of this book gives us an inkling of how does the Archaeological Survey of India do archaeology. What kind of techniques, methodologies, and practices does it employ? What are the sociological, political, and the ideological processes of its knowledge production mechanism? This book also investigates how the Archaeological Survey of India conducts excavations. How does it discover artifacts in a trench, and how they are transformed into facts? This book very succinctly investigates how the ASI acts in the making of artifacts into facts. Today, we have the author of this book with us. Welcome, Dr. Ashish Avikunthak. Dr. Ashish Avikunthak is a filmmaker, a cultural anthropologist, and archaeologist who has spent more than 20 years researching the state of Indian archaeology. Having been a student of Deccan College, Pune between 1994-96, he has been associated with and learned from such well-known archaeologists like K. Padaya, V.N. Mishra, and Vasant Shinde, all big banner names in archaeology. At Stanford University, where he was between 1999 to 2007, he interacted with such scholars like Ian Hodder, author of such works as Reading the Past, Current Approaches to Interpretation in Archaeology, and Archaeological Theory Today, as well as with Michael Shanks, the author of Muscle and Shovel. Between 2007 and 2010, Avikunthak was at Yale, where he was affiliated with Center of South Asian Studies. From 2010 onwards, he joined the film media program at the Harrington School of Communication, University of Rhode Island. He is at the moment an associate professor there. Presently, his interests lie both in archaeology and in making films. He was named Future Greats 2014 by Art Review and has been making films for more than 25 years. His films have been the subject of more than a dozen retrospectives, 16 solo shows, and they have been shown worldwide in major film festivals, group shows, and museums. Further, he has a PhD in cultural and social anthropology from Stanford University and has earlier taught at Yale University. The Cambridge University Press has recently published his monograph, which I just showed, Bureaucratic Archaeology, State, Science and Past in Post-Colonial India. This book uncovers an endemic link between micro-practice of archaeology in the trenches of ASI to the manufacture of archaeological knowledge wielded in the making of political and religious identity and summoned as indelible evidence in the juridical adjudication in the highest courts in India. Moreover, it is a rare ethnography of the daily practice of a post-colonial bureaucracy from within rather than from the outside. It meticulously uncovers the social, cultural, political, and epistemological ecology of ASI or archaeologists to show how post-colonial state assembles and produces knowledge. Bureaucratic Archaeology is also the first book-length monograph on the workings of archaeology in a non-Western world, which meticulously shows how theory of archaeological practice deviates, transforms, and generates knowledge outside the Euro-American epistemological tradition. I welcome the learned author and filmmaker in our program. I won't say anything further about this work, and I leave now the space to Dr. Ashish Avikunthak, who would tell us in detail about this excellent work of his. Welcome, Ashish, and please go ahead.
थैंक यू वेरी मच नदीम जी. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया कि आपने इस कार्यक्रम में मुझे बुलाया. I want to start with the moment that you started with, which was 6th of December 1992, because the origin of the book starts on that day, so as to say. What I actually tried doing with this in this book, it's very important to contextualize where I come from, in the sense that it's important to contextualize my biography, because this work is just not merely a scholarly enterprise. For me, it is also a deeply political enterprise. So I come from a Punjabi family. Uh, my parents were refugees. Both my parents were born in erstwhile pre-partition Pakistan, pre-partition India, and they lived in Delhi and in Western UP in refugee families. My father moved to Calcutta, where I was raised in the late 60s, and I was brought up in a neighborhood of Calcutta, which saw a lot of East Pakistan, as in refugees from the other side of the country. So I have lived all my life as somebody uh, who, although was very came from this deep sense of complex historical framework. But both my Punjabi family and the Bengali refugee neighborhood I lived never ever uh, taught me or propagated uh, Islamophobia, which has now become a center of Indian political life as we speak. So, what happened is that in 1991, I moved to Bombay as an undergraduate student of social work. So, my early life, I spent working as a political activist. I was very, very active with Narmada Bachao Andolan, which was at that time spearheaded by Medha Patkar, and I was very closely involved with it. And that's the reason I moved to Bombay. And in 92, in December, the Babri Masjid was destroyed. As we all know, from the mid 80s, the right of Hindutva framework had emerged, and so by the early 90s, the atmosphere had hugely vitiated, and but none of us, and as you know, Nadeem ji, none of us were uh, sure what would happen in Babri Masjid. So it came as a brutal shock when the masjid was destroyed. And for me, the next 6 months was extraordinarily traumatic, because immediately after the riots, immediately after the destruction, from 7th of December, as you know, as we all know, terrible communal riots began all over India, and especially in the city of Bombay, which saw two very ferocious rioting, first in the month of December and then in the month of January. And I was very deeply part of that world, which was hugely traumatic. I worked as a social worker, so I spent the next few months, till the whole of 1993, so much as a relief activist, working in the slums of Bombay with the victims in places like, if you know Bombay, in places like Bhandup, Bandra East, Jogeshwari, all over the city, which saw intense rioting. And it is during those years that I started thinking very closely about the relationship between history and violence in Indian society, especially in post-colonial India. That took me to the doorsteps of archaeology, which is the center of the the reason why the Babri Masjid was destroyed, the rational reasons, as to say. I then went to do my master's in archaeology, as is pointed out, at Deccan College. Now, Deccan College is one of the foremost institutes of archaeological thinking in India. especially with a very strong theoretical and methodological focus. And that really fascinated me because I got really interested. So my question then moved to, how does archaeology play a role, not just history, but archaeology play a role in the construction of what India had become uh, in the 1990s. And one thing led to another, and ended up in early 2000 at Stanford University to do my PhD with two of the foremost theoretical archaeologists in the discipline, Ian Hodder and Michael Shanks. Uh, and that opened up my world far more deeply. And I became very, very interested, not just in archaeology in India, but archaeological disciplinary discourse. What does it mean to produce knowledge, not just in India, but everywhere? What is the disciplinary, discursive, methodological, and technological impetus of the discipline? What And this is something very important, especially in places like India, where we look at disciplines like archaeology and history with a lot of legitimacy. That And we know that a discipline like archaeology, especially that the knowledge that is produced by the Archaeological Survey of India, almost becomes like fact. And this is something, as I was doing my PhD, and then later on, and as you have mentioned, we have seen how the highest courts of India, both the High Court and the Supreme Court, take the knowledge that was produced or that has been produced by the ASI with a very powerful sense of finality, legitimacy, and facts. So I got very interested in understanding how archaeology, and for me, this is the fundamental uh, question that I'm asking in this book. How does archaeology make factual knowledge? Now, this is a very generic question, right? And this question can be answered by doing work anywhere in the world where archaeology is practiced. And I was very interested to work in India because there hasn't been any work on theory and methodology of archaeological practice in India. We have seen a lot, not a lot, a fair amount of work on the history of archaeology in India. And here, I think scholars like Dilip Chakravarti, Nainjot Lahiri has played a very important role in explaining us what has been the teleology of colonial archaeology in India, how archaeology as a discipline emerged, and especially in the context of Archaeological Survey of India. But there hasn't been any work done in how archaeology produces knowledge. And I got really interested in that idea. And I wanted to think through in the context of the excavation of Ayodhya and in the context of the Harappan civilization. Now, before I get into why Ayodhya, it is important to understand, or why Harappa, I think it is important for me to explain you why I picked up these two areas. And that has a lot to do with what we are now seeing, the rise of what could be called Hindutva archaeology, or the term that was used, or that the term that is often used on the ground level as Bhagwa archaeology. We have to understand that statist archaeology in India, which is the Archaeological Survey of India, and archaeology that has emerged in the form of Hindutva archaeology, somewhere merges in a very complicated fashion to produce empirical or fake empirical data about the Ayodhya Babri Masjid excavations of the 70s, which, as we know, has a very, very powerful detrimental impact with the destruction of the masjid on 6th of December. Uh, so what I'm trying to do in this work is, at one level, I'm trying to construct a historical framework where we have statist archaeologists in the form of ASI, scientific archaeological practice in the form of larger archaeological theory, and then the rise of Hindutva archaeology, which starts as early as the 1970s. And I'm trying to dovetail all of them. And then I'll go into this relationship a little later, but I'm just kind of constructing what I try to do. But the majority, or let's say the meat of the book, is not about Hindutva archaeology or Ayodhya or even the Harappan archaeology. The meat of the book is archaeological practice. Now, this is something that we know, and this is something, since you were there as an observer during the Ayodhya excavation. Archaeological excavation is a highly for the ASI and for archaeologists in India or even all over the world, I would say it's a guarded process, very much in the same way that we would think of a scientific lab. Right now we are in the midst of a COVID epidemic, and I think all of us, or most of us, have been have done RT-PCR tests. Now, the RT-PCR test is a good example of how a lab works, right? Somebody comes, takes your sample, and then a couple of days later you get the report. But we never get access to what happens in the lab. Who are the people working in the lab? What kind of methodology that has been used in the lab? We assume, and we do it rightly so, that there is a certain scientific process that occurs, but we do not have access to that. Now, this question is that what happens inside the lab or inside the laboratory is a question that has been asked by sociologists of science and historians of science nearly 50 years ago. Is that there was a very strong impetus in the discipline of science studies to understand what happens inside the lab. Any kind of lab. And in the 1970s, some of the foremost scholars of sociology of science, who I take inspiration in working in this book, Bruno Latour, and in India, there's a very important scholar, Shiv Vishwanathan. In the 70s and the 80s, both these scholars, one in India, another in America, get into the laboratory and show us what happens. And they open up the world of the scientist inside the lab. So much so, this can be thought of as thinking of scientists inside labs as almost like a tribe, like an anthropologist would conceptualize a tribe. And these scientists enter into that world to open up that world, to tell us what happens, how is knowledge produced, what is the social relationship of people in this society. And some very stunning works have emerged along with in the last 3 or 4 decades, which begins with works by Bruno Latour and others. At Stanford, for instance, one of my favorite work that emerged is by a feminist anthropologist who gets into the world of high energy physicists who are working in linear accelerators and especially at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, and looking at and trying to bombard atoms and molecules to produce knowledge. And she does a brilliant study about how scientists, physicists, high energy physicists, theoretical physicists, and people who work in the lab work together or don't work together to produce knowledge. So, what I do in this work is that I conceptualize archaeologists in India as a community, and I enter into that world. I entered into that world because archaeological excavation, very much like a lab that we see, where we send our RT-PCR tests, are closed spaces. We really don't know there. And I think what you speak about, or what you did during the Ayodhya excavation as an observer, as my for the first time in India, it was during the Ayodhya excavation with observers like you and journalists who were going and reporting at the Ayodhya excavation, that we really get a clue of what happens inside an archaeological excavation. And that really excited me. So I actually reached India after finishing my master's and my graduate coursework to begin my fieldwork just few months after the end of Ayodhya excavation in 2003. So from 2003 to 2005, 2 seasons, I did ethnographic work in the Archaeological Survey of India's excavation in Harappan sites. And this was something very important because, as you mentioned, along with Ayodhya, the transformation of the Harappan civilization from a civilization that was located on the Indus riverine system to a civilization that was located in a mythical river, Saraswati, about which we do not have any empirical evidence. That shift was happening. And I ended up doing ethnography of Archaeological Survey of India in the season of 2003-2004, when it was in Harappan side as part of the Saraswati Heritage Project. Then in 2004, the first NDA government was defeated and the UPA government came, and the Saraswati Heritage Project was shelved. And then in the season of 2004 and 2005, I went back to the same sites, but this time they were not part of the Saraswati Heritage Project, because at that time the Minister of Culture, I think, was Jaipal Reddy, if I'm right. He had shelved the SHP, the Saraswati Heritage Project, and so in the season of 2004-2005, ASI was back to its normal excavation, so as to say. However, so in these 2 seasons, I spent doing ethnographic work, and then subsequently, I also spent a lot of time in the offices of Archaeological Survey of India, in the DG office, especially in Delhi, talking to archaeologists of different kinds for more than 2 to 3 years. And then subsequently, I spent a huge amount of time working at the Archaeological Survey of India's archives, the National Archive, and then the Parliament Archive. And I also came to Aligarh Muslim University, met with Professor Irfan Habib, who and also with the lawyers who were part of the Babri Masjid litigation. I also spent a lot of time speaking with the Sangh archaeologists, some of them who have passed away, especially S.P. Gupta, who was very closely involved with the saffronization of Indian archaeology. I spent a lot of time in his office looking up his archive. So the work that you see in this book has ethnographic focus of 2003 and 2005, but archival focus that goes reaches as late as 2019, 2020, when Niti Aayog came out with its nearly 200-page report about how ASI should cease to be a knowledge producing organization, but should become a heritage management organization. So, what I'm interested in this book is that I'm looking at the state of archaeology in the last 20, 25 years, locating it within a historical, post-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial period, and trying to see how the rise of the statist archaeologist, or this rise of statist archaeology in the form of ASI, merges with the rise of Hindutva archaeology. Now, what I do in this book is that I spend a lot of time showing the reader what happens inside an archaeological excavation. Specifically, I then move into what happens inside an archaeological trench. So there are three chapters that deal specifically with what happens at the site, what happens at the trenches. I show how knowledge is produced, or let's say even something like how a potsherd is discovered and then labeled as an artifact. And this is something something very deeply philosophical that I get into. Let's say what you would say philosophy of science is that how do you even conceptualize an artifact as associated with a culture, and then how you associate that culture with, let's say, a group of people who existed more than 3 to 4,000 years ago. We are making a lot of interpretative leaps at every moment of our knowledge making processes. And that is what I spend a lot of time in this book. Eventually, how an artifact or how an archaeological site gets transformed into a scientific evidence. And here, a very important character, a historical character, emerges, who's almost like a leitmotif in this book, and somebody that all archaeologists in India and probably throughout the world would have known, and that's Mortimer Wheeler, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who was an archaeologist, a military man, an archaeologist who was the Director General of Archaeology, Archaeological Survey of India, at a very, very crucial period in Indian history from 1944 to 1948. One of the reasons he is very important for us, and what I noticed, not just for us, but specifically for the archaeologist of Archaeological Survey of India, is that he's almost like a guru-like figure, almost like a god-like figure. Because for the archaeologists who work in the ASI, he is the archaeologist, or he is the theoretician who brings in scientific methodology to the ASI. The argument, and this is an argument that Mortimer Wheeler makes, that archaeologists like John Marshall and archaeologists who followed after John Marshall's retirement in the 1920s and 30s did not do scientific archaeology. And this is what Wheeler argues. He says that they're only doing treasure hunting archaeology and then producing books. His argument is that archaeology is a scientific discipline, and he is deeply inspired by archaeologists who are emerging in Europe and especially in England, who are thinking about archaeological practice as a scientific discipline. 1920s and 30s is an extraordinary moment in the history of archaeology discipline worldwide, because it's around this time that monumental excavations are happening, not just in India, but also in Mesopotamia. By this time, Egypt is already a hugely well-explored archaeological space. So archaeology in the early 20th century was already a very, very powerful instrument of knowledge production. And what Wheeler tries to do as early as the late 20s and 1930s, before he comes to India, is that he tries to instill a basic scientific methodology into the archaeological practice. And this scientific practice is not extraordinarily complex. What he does was basically systematizing the archaeological practice in the form of, rather than randomly and arbitrary excavating, which was very common, excavating close to the monument to dig monuments, right? To dig up big things. He argues that we have to do excavation has to be systematic, and he introduces something which is very, very common in archaeological practice in India and all over the world, is Cartesian grids, is that you excavate in boxes rather than randomly excavating. And this is, along with this, he also introduces the three-dimensional recording methods in archaeology. And so he is somebody who introduces basic scientific principles that he's borrowing from disciplines like geology, from like cartography and geography into archaeology, and makes it more than scientific. He makes it systematic. And so when he comes to India in 1944, he is a very zealous archaeologist, because he's not just interested in excavating in India, but he's also very, very interested in what is what is something common among colonial administrator. He wants to discipline Indian archaeology. And this is something important, is that what you see in 1944 with Wheeler is that scientific method introduction in Indian archaeology by Wheeler is also deeply colonial. It is also comes with a very strong civilizing the native, disciplining the native. Here, for Wheeler, this civilizing mission, this disciplining mission is this native. He specifically means the Indian archaeologist. And this he does in a very powerful way by starting field schools. And this is Wheeler is one of the few archaeologists who begins the field school, where he would bring in the world. And in 1944, we have the first field archaeological schools in India, which was run by Wheeler at the site of Takshila, where he does the first archaeological excavation in India. Now, this is a very important moment in the history of post-colonial archaeology, because at this particular school and the subsequent school he does at also at Arikamedu, is that he brings young archaeologists who were part of ASI, who were part of university systems in late colonial India, to become members, or he teaches them scientific archaeology. Of this, one of the foremost archaeologists whose shadows we see till the destruction of Babri Masjid is Professor Brijbhasi Lal, B.B. Lal, who was one of the star student of Mortimer Wheeler during his field school. So here is a very interesting connection that I'm trying to make between the relationship between scientific archaeology and Hindutva archaeology, between state archaeology and Hindutva archaeology. There is a very strong relationship. And this is something that should not come as a surprise, because as we see now in the Modi government, is that if you look at Modi government very clearly, they are not producing new laws to subjugate or to oppress or to construct situation of apartheid, as we see now with the hijab crisis in India. They are just, and this is something very important, they are just using laws, using systems, using structures which have colonial origin, which have origin in the Congress regime. All they are just doing is that they are using, and I'm going to use an analogy, they are using the knives, they're sharpening the knives which were manufactured earlier. And this is something that we see in the state of archaeology also in India, is that it is no point. I think I would argue that just to argue that Hindutva archaeology is nothing new. What you see in Ayodhya is that what archaeologists of the ASI did was to follow a method that Wheeler had introduced more than 50 years. For more than 50, 60 years. Wheeler is the what should I say, the epistemic framework of ASI. Now, what is interesting is that the Wheelerian method, the method that Wheeler introduces into Indian archaeology in the 1940s, were cutting edge at that time. But by the 1960s, with the rise of what we call processual archaeology, which became very common throughout the American and the European archaeological tradition, which had discarded Wheelerian method for a much more empirical and a scientific approach. And subsequently in the 90s, with the rise of what we call postprocessing archaeology, archaeology as a disciplinary formation has evolved very radically to what Wheeler did in the 1940s. What I saw, and that was a surprise, is that when I started working, doing my ethnography in the ASI, I noticed that they still follow the Wheelerian method. Most Indian archaeologists in the ASI are not familiar with the methods that was introduced by Binford and the processualist archaeologists in the 60s and the 70s, and they're not even aware of the theoretical debates that scholars like Hodder, Michael Shanks, and others had completely ruffled the state of archaeological theory in the 90s. And so what I saw was a very interesting, or what I observed was a very interesting moment, not just in the state of Indian archaeology, but the state of archaeology worldwide. Is here you had an interesting moment of a practice which had been discarded all over the world, the practice of Wheelerian archaeology, which was still being practiced in India. Now, the question that I ask in my book, and something that I try to answer, is that why Wheeler's archaeological practice is still common in the ASI. And here I come to my main argument of the book, which is the reason I call the book Bureaucratic Archaeology, is that Archaeological Survey of India is fundamentally a bureaucratic organization and then an archaeological organization. And there are a lot of empirical reasons to say that. And one I'm just going to point out is that in ASI, only 1 to 2% of the whole budget of ASI goes into archaeological excavation. Now, this is something very, very interesting, is that the epistemic legitimacy that ASI has, and we have seen that in the way the High Court and the Supreme Court legitimizes the Ayodhya report. The kind of legitimacy ASI, and not even just what the courts do, but the nature of knowledge production processes. If ASI has excavated a site, it has produced a legitimate, almost a knowledge which has legal implications, but that is just less than 1 to 2% of the total budget of the ASI. So this was quite interesting. And I started thinking about it. Why is the case? And the case is very simple. ASI is fundamentally a bureaucratic archaeology organization which happens to do archaeology, although it gains legitimacy from archaeological excavations. Now, in this bureaucratic atmosphere, in this deeply hierarchical, oppressive bureaucratic space, which is something which is no different to other bureaucratic organizations in India. Either if you go into any other bureaucratic organization, or when I mean by bureaucratic, any administrative organization, any status organization, either it is part of the central government or it is part of the state governments, and all of us have had experiences when we go to get driver's license, for instance, or if we go to get passports, or if we have to get death certificates, or any of these bureaucratic things that even as individuals who are outside, and I'm talking about especially as middle class individuals living in cities, I'm not even, I mean, like the kind of things that we hear, although I have not experienced what you see in rural India, people who have to get who have to go to ration shops to get food, or who have to get their employment through Menegra and other, is that the bureaucratic system in India is deeply oppressive and hierarchical. And this oppression and hierarchical is not just how bureaucracy deals with the outside world, with non-bureaucratic subjects like us or like others. But what I found in my book, or what I talk about in my book, and what I found is that the bureaucratic system within itself is also very oppressive. So the archaeologists, the laborers, the assistant archaeologists, the staff, they are being oppressed by their seniors, let's say the superintendent archaeologists, who then are subsequently kind of pressurized or oppressed by their seniors. And so then it goes all the way till the Director General of Archaeology, who is complaining about how the IS secretaries are oppressing them. So what I saw was a deeply, and what I observed was a deeply hierarchical, oppressive structure. In that hierarchical, oppressive structure, the model that Mortimer Wheeler introduces into India as scientific is deeply colonial. Fundamentally, Mortimer Wheeler's scientific archaeology is about disciplining not just the artifacts and knowledge that is produced, but also fundamentally disciplining the laborers, the workers, the archaeologists within the excavation site. So if we think of the excavation site as a laboratory, the laboratory that I enter, I noticed a highly oppressive landscape. And in that landscape, the methodology that Wheeler introduces in late colonial India within the ages of colonial ideological framework continues. You must have heard, when I was working with the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and I'm going to end my presentation with this quote, which is what I end my book with, is that when I was working, we used to sing a song, और मैं हिंदी में बोलता हूँ क्योंकि गाना हिंदी में था, कि गोरे हाकिम गयो रे भैया आ गए हाकिम काले, बदली नहीं है चाबी लेकिन बदल गए हैं ताले. क्या मैं झूठ बोल दिया? So this is the crisis of Indian bureaucratic system. And what I'm trying to do, I do not have access to Indian bureaucratic system in an empirical way. What I had access in an empirical way as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer, was this world of archaeological excavation. And there also I saw this, that that people, the Gore Hakim like Wheeler, had disappeared, but the infrastructure that they had created still continues to oppress. And instead of the Gore Hakim, we have the Kale Hakim. And that is what this book is about, is that within this kind of an oppressive landscape, how is knowledge produced? And I think, and what I want to argue, or what I'm arguing in the book, is that this is a highly compromised knowledge. This is a highly, I don't want to use the word, but it's a corrupted knowledge. Now here, corruption is not just associated with money and capital, but here I'm talking about an epistemic corruption, a corruption which is at the heart of knowledge production mechanism, where at one hand you see a system that Wheeler introduces that still continues because it is convenient, because it is oppressive, it is useful, it is controlling, it is discipline. And also on the other hand, you see a system where you have the rise of statist archaeology, the post-colonial bureaucratic system, and on top of which which is the rise of Hindutva archaeology. So here we're talking about a deeply, deeply, deeply complex world, multi-layered world, a world in which it is very, very difficult to remove the strands, to remove the layers, because they are so deeply kind of ensconced within one another, almost like an onion peel. Like an onion, it's like layers over layers over layers, like an archaeological site, one layer on. And so what I'm trying to do in this book is that my attempt is to unpack, is to open up not just the epistemic world, the social world, the political world, and I'm trying to constantly, in a microscopic manner, I'm constantly trying to, which is what I do throughout the book, is that I'm constantly trying to underscore that whatever interpretation that I, as an anthropologist, am making is located within my own self-reflexive world. Yeah, I think on that note, I should stop my initial comments, and I'll open up questions from you, and then probably I can speak more about other things.
Well, Ashish ji, thanks a lot. I mean, for unraveling uh, an organization like Archaeological Survey of India uh, and narrating to us the actual functioning of this organization and how uh, it is helping or obstructing the creation of knowledge in a way. Uh, when one starts reading your book, and I would start with that, uh, your preface. I mean, in fact, Ashish's book, which I hold in my hand, uh, is uh, let me, yeah, containing, uh, a preface, a conclusion, naturally, as all books do, and then 9 chapters, starting with anthropology of archaeology and ending with a very perceptive theme uh, about which I would be further asking him: the absent excavation reports. I mean, that possibly chapter one and the last chapter, uh, in fact, tells you the entire story of this organization and what type of work is being carried out by the highly rated Archaeological Survey of India. I think Ashish Saab would also not deny it, and I would also, salute the type of work, some of the work which Archaeological Survey of India initially did to conserve, preserve, and present before us not only the monuments of this country, starting with Cunningham, but also a very elaborate analysis of some of the very important, structural remains, which are part of our heritage, part of our culture. I mean, naturally, ASI has also done much work, which has to be saluted, which has to be, taken into account. Um, I, started, unlike Ashish, you, uh, as a historian, a student of history, uh, and as a teacher of medieval Indian history, I was introduced to these structures, medieval monuments, um, their import, their uh, contributions to our making the making of our history, and then ultimately I also took up as a teacher the job of introducing my students to one field of archaeology, and that is historical archaeology, with a special reference to medieval archaeology. But till 2003, uh, I was just a teacher who would be drawing the various stratas and layers on my blackboard, telling the students how you can identify the various layers without actually imbibing the import of how one physically would do it if you're brought to the site. Uh, in 1991, uh, the first attempt on Ayodhya was made when the dome was broken. Uh, there were the incident 6th of December was followed by massive riots throughout the country. We experienced that. One full year passed. 1992 came, from where you start your book, in a way. The structure was demolished. Not only was it demolished, but once again, the entire country was thrown into flames. You were there in Bombay. I was here in UP at Aligarh, supposed to be a city. In fact, the area where I live to be a peaceful area, but I still remember the mics blaring those, blood curdling, slogans coming to our houses, and we sitting in our house and worrying what would happen. I mean, it was illogical on our part because no one could have come there, but the fear psychosis which had developed. Let me say that that was the beginning of what we see today. Ultimately, I mean, all those things, impacted our life. Uh, just as your long introduction, I am giving my introduction to the topic. Uh, from being just a simple teacher drawing with a stock layers on the blackboard, now I started, giving some importance to the subject itself. क्या है ये आखिर? कि एक छोटी सी मॉन्यूमेंट जिसपे एक ऐसी मस्जिद जिसको कोई विजिट नहीं करता था, लोकल महल्ले वालों के अलावा कोई नमाज पढ़ने नहीं जाता था, पूरी कम्युनिटी की ऑनर का रिप्रेजेंटेटिव बन गया, और मेजॉरिटी कम्युनिटी की तरफ से एक ऐसा सिंबल बन गया कि अगर इसको क्रश कर दिया तो यू हैव क्रश्ड द अदर. I mean, so it in fact impacted me to a level when I started paying attention to the monuments. And from only sitting in the library, I started visiting sites and looking at things which were still surviving. The result was my book on Fatehpur Sikri. I mean, that's another story altogether. Now, cutting back everything and coming over to 2003, when our courts, in their wisdom, I am still unable to understand what made them come up with this, that archaeology would help them decide a title suit, as if anything buried beneath a particular structure would. Incidentally, I mean, my house, which is there in eastern UP, बहुत पुराना घर है, वो सीधा भी है, अब हम लोगों ने थोड़ा बहुत बना लिया है, लेकिन यू नो विद इन दैट जब उस थोड़ा सा उसको खोदा गया फाउंडेशंस में, वी गॉट अ स्कल्पचर
Completely.
है ना. सो माय यू नो माइंड वुड आस्क, क्या हम मंदिर तोड़ के ये घर बनवाए बैठे हैं? Is this what the Supreme Court or the High Court at that moment was asking us to do? Whatever. Those excavations started and we started taking interest in them. I still remember the time कि हर आदमी जो था वो जरूर वो उस रिपोर्ट को पढ़ता था, आज क्या मालूम कि वो वहां से निकल के आया. I mean, the entire nation, just like in the period of those serials Ramayana and Mahabharata,
They was looking at this. Yeah.
the same fashion. I mean, people would look at the newspapers, आज क्या निकल के आया, and the Hindi newspapers especially would be full of news कि आज ये निकल के आया है और ये हुआ था और वो हुआ था. So that's sort of an excitement which was generated in the country, and in the type of feelings which were being now generated throughout the country. दोनों communities को एक तरीके से अपने अपने उसमें ढालने का एक बहुत बड़ा जरिया एक छोटा सा स्ट्रक्चर में बन गया. Right. Fortunately, when this High Court sponsored excavations started, one of the litigants, the Babri Masjid Action Committee, they wanted कि उसकी देखभाल के लिए क्या कर रहे हैं, क्या नहीं कर रहे हैं, there should be observers. So I mean, a series of observers started visiting the place. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was one of them, and thus got a chance to see things close at hand. You know, when I read your passages dealing with the actualities of, as you said, RT-PCR टेस्ट होता है, हम सब उसको बिलीव कर लेते हैं, लेकिन लैब में क्या हो रहा है, वो 3-4 बार मुझे मौका मिल गया लैब में जाने का. To put it simply,
सही.
और 3 बार एक हफ्ते के लिए मैं उस लैब में मौजूद था. And I could see that you have just pointed out that it was the ASI is still following the Wheeler method. बाद में आप उसके colonial और दूसरे negative aspects पे you came, but initially you said the scientific approach of Wheeler, and surely Wheeler established the archaeology in the country. जो भी आज है वो उसी की वजह से, Wheeler method की वजह से हो रहा है. The type of excavations which are right. But I would say that it was not the Wheeler method which was being used there. It was a parody of the Wheeler method which was being applied.
True.
From digging down to labeling, down to taking out the pottery and other artifacts और उनको pottery sherd में रखने से लेके और शाम को उसको नोट करने तक, it was just a parody of what should have been done. Daily there was a fight between the observers and the ASI officers. आप क्या रिपोर्ट कर रहे हैं?
मैं
जी
मैं ये आपने देखिए जो अयोध्या में हुआ था, जो मैंने ASI आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट से बात की, वो भी, and I'm like they were also very very upset क्योंकि वो तो कहते हैं, और मैं किताब में लिखता हूं कि वो कोर्ट का डंडा पड़ा और एएसआई काम करना चला गया, क्योंकि they were also very very shocked, and exactly what you said, this is something I heard from the ASI archaeologists, कि ये तो जमीन का मामला है, आर्कियोलॉजी क्यों घुसा रहे हैं आप इसमें?
Well, I will add to that. I mean, Ashish, आपने उनसे बात की और मैंने वहां एक्सपीरियंस किया,
करेक्ट
है ना,
करेक्ट,
है ना? जो आप कह रहे हैं, दैट्स दी हकीकत, इन द सेंस that those ASI officers, when the press would be there, they would be our adversaries. They would pose कि नहीं, ये यहाँ के ऊपर ये निकल रहा है. And when the camera was not there, I'm not going to take names of those officers who were there, those assistant archaeologists, they would come sit with us, lunch break में, smoking breaks में, they would say कि हम फंस गए हैं यहाँ ऊपर. This is नदीम साहब, ये हम ऐसे नहीं करते हैं, आप प्लीज हमें गलत मत समझिए, हम क्या करें, right? So I'm sorry I took so much of your time. I was reminded of all those things, and I would just tell the audience that whatever Ashish has written in those sections of his work, I have actually experienced them for brief period, of course. मैं 3 बार गया एक हफ्ते के लिए, लेकिन 3 हफ्ते भी बाबरी मस्जिद साइट पे जहां इतना खोद दिया गया हो, is more than enough. What you write, I think, but I would like to ask you certain other things before I take up 1 or 2 questions which have been put to you. Before I come to other things, when you start your, in your first chapter, you end that. In fact, the ending passages of your first chapter, you talk about, and you referred it in your talk as well, the palpable fear for your informants, expectations of punitive consequences, and one assumes that you delayed your publication in order to protect these informants of yours. Can you make certain comments on that? That's a very important thing for us today to understand कि क्या situation है कि जिसमें एक scholarly work को भी अपने इसको छुपाने के लिए इतना time लग जाता है, और वो लोग जो उसमें involve हैं वो बड़े position पे पहुंच के भी, in fact the passages you have, the quotations which you have given, हालांकि वो कह रहे हैं कि अब आप कर सकते हैं, लेकिन they also show कि अभी भी दिल में डर बाकी. So can you elaborate on that?
देखिए नदी जी, ये जो डर है, ये डर ब्यूरोक्रेसी का डर है, क्योंकि आज भी अगर आप किसी भी ब्यूरोक्रेटिक सिस्टम में रहें तो क्रिटिक करना मुश्किल है. So one of the reasons, let me tell you, I just want to go a little further, which is something also I write a few paragraphs above this line is talking about. So, whatever I have written in my book, as you've also said, this among archaeological community in India, the ASI archaeologists, the university archaeologists, even archaeologists who are in universities in America and Europe, they all are familiar with the world I write about in my book. And the fear is, I'm talking about an earlier fear. The fear I was told when I started this work, and by a very famous, now past American archaeologist, कि आप ये काम क्यों कर रहे हो? And he said कि why are you doing this ethnography of Archaeological Survey of India? आपका करियर सर्वनाश हो जाएगा. और उन्होंने, and that was the thing, कि ASI के बारे में अगर आपने क्रिटिसिज्म किया, अगर आपने बाहर से क्रिटिसिज्म किया, तो आप ASI का आपको कभी लाइसेंस नहीं मिलेगा एक्सकवेशन करने के लिए. और वो हमने देखा है कि यहाँ पर in the history of Indian archaeology, especially postcolonial archaeology, there have been number of archaeologists who, if they have criticized, they have not been given licenses to excavate in sites. Because as you know, in order to excavate in India, you need a license from the ASI. So that is a big fear, not just by this is a fear कि अगर हमने ASI को criticize किया तो हम कभी भी हमारा करियर खत्म हो जाएगा. और विद इन ASI अगर आपने विद इन क्रिटिक किया तो आपका करियर जरूरी खत्म हो जाएगा. और वहां भी बहुत सारे एग्जाम्पल्स मैंने देखे. कुछ लोग, और ये जो ASI में जो हुआ, ये सारे ब्यूरोक्रेटिक सिस्टम में होता है कि अगर आपने इंटरनल रह के क्रिटिसिज्म किया, आपको प्रमोशन नहीं मिलती है, आपको कहीं वो क्या बोलते हैं, जिसको बोलते हैं पनिशमेंट पोस्टिंग में हो जाता है. So this is something that I saw, that I heard. I won't say I saw. I heard, and I spoke to people who were critical within the ASI of the ASI being given punishment posting, and the punishment posting, for instance, included, they would send you to become the director of a museum in some very far-flung site. Where if you're a archaeologist with a family with children who have to go to school, you are then posted at an archaeological site, a museum in the middle, let's say in even a place like Dholavira, for instance, where they have a site museum. If you're an archaeologist with family, it's a hell, because you have to leave your family and be there all alone. And number of stories I heard were about archaeologists who were critical, who were then either denied promotion. And there are a number of stories of, somebody who was an assistant archaeologist for 23 years of his life in ASI, right? So the fear is something that I saw constantly among archaeologists with whom I worked with. And they would tell me कि आप, सो पहला जो डर था जिसके बारे में मैंने, पहला तो इनको डर लग रहा था कि जब मैं घुसा ASI के साइट में कि मैं तो CBI का एजेंट हूं, क्योंकि उस वक्त ASI में 2-3 करप्शन केसेस, काफी हाई लेवल करप्शन केसेस CBI इन्वेस्टिगेट कर रहा था. तो लोगों को लगा कि भाई आप तो, क्योंकि मैं अपना छोटा सा नोटपैड लेके घूमता था लोगों से बात, तो उनको लगा कि भाई आप तो CBI के एजेंट हो, आप यहाँ पर देखने आए कि कौन पैसा खा रहा है, क्या करप्शन हो रहा है. तो एक वो डर था. बाद में जब मैंने उन आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट या उन स्टाफ मेंबर से बात की जो कि अयोध्या में जिन्होंने अयोध्या में एक्सकवेशन किया था, वो तो क्लियरली कह रहे थे कि सर आप प्लीज हमारे बारे में मत बताइएगा, क्योंकि हमारी नौकरी चली जाएगी. और तो जनरल जो फियर है, डर का जो माहौल है, वो तो बहुत ही उस जमाने में 2003, 4, 5, ये जो दो चीजें, एक तो CBI का जो करप्शन केसेस का एक डर था, दूसरा अयोध्या के एक्सकवेशन के बाद जो डर था, ये डर का माहौल बहुत ही व्हाट शुड आई से डीप लेवल में था. तभी भी मुझे समय लगता था लोगों से बात करते हुए, उनको समझाते हुए कि मैं क्या कर रहा हूं, मैं कहां से आ रहा हूं. मैंने जितनी कोशिश की, मैं ट्रांसपेरेंट रहा अपने इन्फॉर्मेंट से, और उन्होंने बहुत ही मोहब्बत से मुझे और बहुत ही रिस्पेक्टफुली मेरे साथ मुझे अपनी जिंदगी में उन्होंने आमंत्रित किया. क्योंकि देखिए एक्सकवेशन, क्योंकि अगर आप इंडियन सिटीजन हो जो मैं हूं, आप एक्सकवेशन में आप जा ही सकते हो, पर वहां पर रात को रहना, खाना, वहां लोगों से मिलना, ये केवल जो एक्सकवेटर है, जो डायरेक्टर ऑफ एक्सकवेशन है, और ये केवल ये ASI, जब मैंने परमिशन ली, तो जब मैं DG ऑफ ASI के पास गया, तो उन्होंने बोला कि देखिए हम तो आपको परमिशन दे देंगे, पर आपका खाना पीना, कैंप में रहना, ये तो केवल आपके लोकल जो एक्स डायरेक्टर हैं वो ही आपको परमिशन दे देते. तो आई हैड टू directors of excavation where I stayed, and they were extraordinary, helpful, very, very supportive. But as I was working, the fear factor constantly came. So once I finished my thesis, and around that time I would speak, because I have been speaking to my informant for the last 20 years. Some of the people, I'm still in touch with them. Some of them have left ASI. Some of them have become senior figures in ASI. Some of them have retired. I am in touch with them, and they would always tell me कि आप जरा ध्यान से लिखिएगा, और क्योंकि हमारी नौकरी का डर है। तो ये मेरे लिए बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट एथिकल पोजीशन था, क्योंकि एज एन एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट हम बेसिकली बहुत इंट्रूसिव डिसिप्लिन है। एंथ्रोपोलॉजी भी बहुत ही, आई मीन आर्कियोलॉजी से ज्यादा कनोलियल है, उसकी प्रैक्टिस अभी भी बहुत ही इंट्रूसिव है। हम लोगों की जिंदगी में चले जाते हैं, उन जिंदगी को खोलने की कोशिश करते हैं। तो ये चीज मेरे लिए बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट थी। ये मेरी एथिकल, एज एन एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट आई हैड टू बी एथिकल। और मैं बार बार अपने इन्फॉर्मेंट्स और दोस्तों से पूछता कि भैया अभी क्या स्थिति है। फिर करीब 2015 के करीब 10 साल के बाद, 10-11 साल के बाद मैंने जब एक्सकवेशन एथनोग्राफी की, उन्होंने कहा कि अब तुम छाप दो, अभी अगर आपने छापा तो इतनी स्थिति गंभीर नहीं होगी। तब मैंने 2015 में मैंने प्रोसेस शुरू किया टू रीराइटिंग माय डिसर्टेशन, then started to look for publication, university presses, and eventually I decided to work with Cambridge University Press, and that is the history of this.
Right, sir. I mean, I think, when you call ASI excavations of 2003 as an aberration, naturally, I think you have elaborated on that in your book as well as in this talk at the moment. Uh, However, I would just like to ask one more question related with these 2003 excavations. If you remember that the excavations started after our Tojo Vikas geophysical survey report came. Uh, can you explain, because you are an accomplished student of archaeology, who also deals with anthropology and a lot of things. I think you will be better placed to inform the general public, because इससे बड़ा मतलब लोग समझ नहीं पा रहे, तो उस वक्त भी और आज भी दिस तोजो विकास जियोफिजिकल सर्वे, when is it used, how is it used, and if used at Ayodhya, was it proper, did it give some insight, what was it entire issue?
देखिए, एक चीज जैसा आपने कहा, आपके पुश्तैनी मकान के बारे में, एक चीज हमें गैंजेटिक वैली के बारे में बहुत ही क्लियरली मालूम है, क्योंकि गैंजेटिक वैली इज वन ऑफ द फ्यू प्लेसेस इन इंडिया वेयर यू हैव एक्सकवेशन हिस्ट्री फॉर नियरली सिंस कनिंघम टाइम्स, इवन अर्लियर, राइट? कि एक चीज हमें गैंजेटिक वैली आर्कियोलॉजी के बारे में बहुत ही क्लियरली, ऑलमोस्ट इंपेरिकली, फैक्चुअली मालूम है कि ये मल्टी लेयर्ड आर्कियोलॉजिकल दुनिया थी। कि यहाँ पे मैं जब गैंजेटिक की बात कर रहा हूँ, मैं बात कर रहा हूँ बिहार, यूपी, उत्तराखंड तक और मध्य प्रदेश, ये पूरा जो इलाका है जहाँ पर गैंजेटिक सिविलाइजेशन, जिसको हम कहते हैं द सेकेंड अर्बनाइजेशन शुरू हुआ है, कि ये बहुत ही मल्टी लेयर्ड साइड है। और जो समथिंग हमें बहुत अच्छी तरह से मालूम है, ये हाईली पॉपुलेटेड साइट है। यहाँ अगर जब हम स्टूडेंट थे तो हम बोलते थे कि आप यूपी, बिहार, इस गैंजेटिक वैली में जहां भी पत्थर फेंकोगे वहां एक्सकवेशन कर सकते हो, क्योंकि ये इतना ही डेंसली पॉपुलेटेड एरिया रहा है फॉर मोर देन 3000 years or even more, 4000 years of human habitation. So if you excavate anywhere in these sites, either in a place like Ayodhya or Banaras or Mathura or any sites that now is at the radar of the Hindutva archaeology, you will find multi-layered habitational deposits. And very clearly on the below the contemporary layer, you'll have the Muslim layer, or what we call the historical medieval Mughal layers, or early Muslim period. Then before that you will have some kind of a Jaina or a Hindu sites, and before that you'll get Buddhists. And this is something that we know very clearly. So in the case of Ayodhya case is very, unfortunately, it's a clear case of fraudulent archaeology. ये आपको समझना बहुत ही जरूरी है, कि जब 1974, 75, 76 में जब एक्सकवेशन हुआ, जो बीबी लाल जी ने शुरू किया था, तब बीबी लाल जी had got the बीबी लाल जी was not part of ASI. He was outside the ASI. He was a university professor, and then he had done this excavation which had some ASI archaeologists were ASI was also part of it. When they excavated, and they did trial excavation, they did not do large scale excavation. They did what we call vertical excavation, which is basically digging a 10 meter by 10 meter or 5 meter by 5 meter holes till you reach the habitation, till the natural layer. And in those reports are now publicly available, because first of all, they were not large reports produced, which should have been the case. Excavation reports were never produced in terms of a book length work. What we saw, or monograph length work, what we saw, a few pages which were published in the IAR, the Indian Archaeological the Indian Archaeological Review, which is the legal official means through which ASI opens to the larger public their work, which is produced every year. और उन रिपोर्टों में बीबी लाल उनमें बीबी लाल जी का जो रिपोर्ट है, उनमें बहुत क्लियरली लिखा गया है कि द मोस्ट एक्साइटिंग फाइंड ड्यूरिंग द एक्सकवेशन इन अयोध्या वर नॉट टेम्पल रिमेन्स, but were very interestingly Roman amphora, Roman pottery इनको मिली थी. That was considered to be the most exciting thing, which is written in the report. कि जो बहुत exciting है कि हमें यहाँ it's Roman pottery मिल रही है, और यहाँ which is interesting, which shows that there was a very, and which I think for archaeologists is very interesting, is that you have which shows mobility, trade, some kind of a movement between Ayodhya and the larger global world, right? So which is a very exciting discovery, and which is what he underscores in those reports. But the politics of Bibi Lalji shifts with the rise of after emergency. Remember, this is 74, 75, this is the middle of emergency. After emergency, we know Jansang becomes a very important part of the Janta Dal, and we know that from early 80s the rise of BJP with Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Advani ji emerges, and then we know exactly by mid 80s the Hindutva as we understand today becomes completely opens up, and it is in that context, in RSS Sangh journal called Manthan, that Bibi Lal, I think in 1986, for the first time says that when he excavated 15 years ago, he found temple remains. Now, this is pathological lying. I'm being very kind when I say that if Bibi Lal ji found something in the excavation in the 70s, he would have, like a good empirical archaeologist, he would have reported that. But he does not report because he actually does not find anything. So the 1986 article that he writes in the Sangh magazine is an afterthought. There's no empirical reasoning to it, and this leads to the birth of Ayodhya's, the Babri Masjid Ayodhya fraudulent narrative. And one thing that is very clear, however weak the archaeological excavation was, one thing is very clear, which was the mainstay of the destruction of Babri Masjid, that this masjid was made by destroying a temple. There is no archaeological evidence of that at all, even in the problematic ASI report. So that is one thing, that there's no evidence of the destruction of a temple. The second thing is, and this is something that I speak about, is that, and this is the problem with the report, is that, and this is the problem with archaeology, is yes, we find some kind of monumental structure under the masjid. And as I told you earlier, as I began by that, anywhere in India, anywhere in North India, you excavate anything, you will find multi-layer archaeological remain. What the report was not able to conclusively show, and which is in throughout and the reason it is unpublished, because it is a really, really weak, even by ASI standard, a weak report. Now, just imagine, and this is something, in ASI, and this is something I write about, in ASI, when Bibi Lal excavated Kalibangan in the 1960s, that report comes out in 2000. The standard time taken to write archaeological report is between 5 to 10 years. Within ASI, it is between 20 to 30 years. If that is the track record, to come out with the report of Ayodhya excavation in matter of days shows very clearly the deep weakness, the epistemic weakness of the excavation process. And again, something that you have, speaking about Nadeem Jain, you have seen it, that to excavate a site like Ayodhya, even by standard historical archaeological practices of ASI, would take at least 3 to 5 years, which we know in the case of Ahichatra, we know in the case of Puranakil excavation, and many excavation that ASI did of a site of a similar historical nature, they would take years to excavate. They would take decades to write the report. यहाँ पर एक ऐसा excavation हो रहा है जो इन्होंने महीनों में खत्म किया और दिनों में रिपोर्ट छाप दी. तो इस स्थिति में आप इस excavation, the epistemic validity of the excavation and the epistemic validity of the report is deeply questionable. And this is something, if you read the High Court, the High Court judgment, which runs into some 10,000 pages, bar, again and again, archaeologists are talking about how the excavation is weak, how the knowledge produced is weak. And this is not something I am speaking. This is something that you see in the High Court document. If you go through it carefully, and I have cited some in my book, is that there's many red flags being shown to the High Court judges that this is a problematic excavation, even by the ASI archaeologist. In the excavation road, something I mentioned is when Mani Sahab and others, they're talking about how this excavation was completely the most difficult, problematic excavation they've ever done. In that context, to put it this way, that this was a botched investigation which the court decides to take into account. अगर आपने कोई criminal investigation किया that gets botched, but you still take that as empirical fact. This is exactly what happened in the Ayodhya case, right? So in that context, now getting back to the key question you asked, the Vikas Tojo, we know that when they went there, they did find some anomalies. Now anomalies, if you look at the word anomaly, the term anomaly is ambivalent. Anything can be anomaly, right? Anomaly doesn't mean anything. What should I say? Profound. You take something like that and you go under. Let's say if you go in a city like Banaras or Mathura and Vrindavan or any, you'll only find anomalies on anomalies. So what the Tojo Vikas thing did is that they told us there is some kind of anomaly, but that was something that we knew, that was nothing profound. But what is interesting is that the High Court, and here we have to go back again and again to the High Court, how it used ASI. Because I think, I had a chance to speak to, out of the three final judges, the court case went for many years, the three judges who had adjudicated, who had written the report, I had a chance to speak to two of them. I interviewed them in Allahabad. The Muslim judge refused to say anything new. He said कि भाई जो मैंने लिखा है वो आप रिपोर्ट में आप मेरे जजमेंट में पढ़ सकते हो. And Agarwal Sahab, who I spoke at length, he spoke about how the political pressures were so much that they just did not have that's you know almost like the excavation was a way of gaining time. The excavation gave them time, and which is what the way they the excavation the excavation started in 2003 and their judgment came in 2010. So the excavation was an excuse to delay the whole process. And but what was very interesting about the excavation is that it showed us how complicated the nature of evidence is, especially when you take an archaeological evidence and you put it in a juridical domain, in a juridical context. So the issue about dojo vikas or the way is inconsequential for a minute, because they were just part of the process. Something that we have been hearing now with the Modi government is something that we hear often, is that the process is the punishment. And I think this is something you have to understand. This is the way bureaucracy works, is that the process becomes complex, oppressive, that the process itself can become very, very oppressive. And I think what happens in the case of Ayodhya, that everybody, especially the archaeologists working, they were not happy at all, as you have said also. It was a difficult time, and this report, no wonder this report has not been published. It's actually I would say one of the few, or probably one of the only reports of the ASI which has been written but has not been published, and it's going to be nearly 20 years now. There are cases of many, many reports of ASI which has never been published because they were never written, right? But the Ayodhya excavation report is very interesting. It has been written but not been published. And when I spoke to archaeologists, and they would always say, "Ki," when I write about in the book also, "Ki, the report is so weak, we don't want it to be published."
Uh, you know, uh, not only published, but there is another thing. It is restricted. सिर्फ एक चीज होती है कि नहीं छपी, लेकिन अनफॉर्चुनेटली वो कोर्ट केस की वजह से दैट हैज ओनली बीन सबमिटेड टू द कोर्ट। द जनरल पब्लिक के लिए इट इज नॉट एट ऑल एक्सेसिबल। अगर मेरे पास है, अगर मैं उसको बांटना चाहूं तो आई हैव टू थिंक ट्वाइस ऑफ डूइंग दैट बिकॉज इट इज रेस्ट्रिक्टेड, राइट? And possibly one of the banes of Indian archaeology, bureaucratization of Indian archaeology in your terms, is the fact that a large number of these reports go unpublished. For example, this whole process which you talked about, Ramayana archaeology or Mahabharata archaeology, ये बीबी लाल जी और एसपी गुप्ता जी का जो ये चलाया हुआ जो वो था, अनफॉर्चुनेटली उनकी जो अयोध्या की पहली रिपोर्ट थी, जिसके एक्सट्रैक्ट्स आपने साइट किए, where I mean it was only very short reports which were published, एक एक पैराग्राफ की रिपोर्ट या एक एक पेज की रिपोर्ट. The entire report was never published. He never showed us the site diaries. I remember I was a student when Bibi Lal was invited to Aligarh, and in our seminar room, he delivered a lecture on Ramayana archaeology. And he started talking about the fact that they had discovered certain, pillar bases. And when Irfan Habib and others questioned him on them, he had no answer. जैसा आपने पॉइंट आउट किया कि 10-15 साल के बाद मंथन में आरएसएस के पेपर में उन्होंने रिपोर्ट किया, और आज की तारीख तक इनफैक्ट बीबी लाल साहब हैज येट टू टेल अस आल्सो कि कौन-कौन लोग उसमें इन्वॉल्व थे. 2 years back there was a controversy between me and certain other people, published in Times of India and a large number of other papers, where I contested that there was one person from Aligarh who claimed that he was part of the B. Bilal team. And I challenged him on that because I had the documents of the department showing his presence at Aligarh. He never went there. He might have gone there as a student. जैसे हम students को ले जाते हैं. In that case, he cannot claim that he was a part of the team. And then the Times of India reporter contacted B. Bilal, and B. Bilal very blatantly gave an interview. I don't know whether it was his voice or somebody else, but it was published in the Times of India. B. Bilal says he was part of my team. जब आप वो शॉर्ट रिपोर्ट्स एएसआई की छपी हुई हैं उसमें अगर आप कहीं ढूंढिएगा उस शख्स का कहीं नाम जिक्र नहीं होगा क्योंकि ही वाज नेवर देयर राइट सो एक व्हील है जो इस टाइप की चाहे वो हस्तिनापुर हो चाहे अयोध्या हो रामायण एंड महाभारत आर्कियोलॉजी जो रिलीजियस ये चीजें शुरू हुई हैं वन ऑफ द boons for these Hindutva elements is the unpublished reports. Now, after many years, they can claim anything which they want. In fact, as अभी हम लोगों ने बात की कि जो रिपोर्ट लिखी भी जा चुकी with all its defects, I mean, किसी चैप्टर वो कंक्लूजन पे जहां पे किया गया है जो पूरे रिपोर्ट की गई है कि मंदिर मौजूद है उस पे ऑथर का नाम तक नहीं है कि who is claiming that. हर चैप्टर पे एक ऑथर मौजूद है लेकिन यहाँ और कहीं पे भी मंदिर की बात नहीं है एकदम से लास्ट में आके कहते हैं कि भव्य मंदिर था बट हु इज द पर्सन व्हिच आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट दैट इज नॉट मेंशन्ड एंड पॉसिबली वन ऑफ द रीजंस कि इट्स नाउ वेरी इजी टू मेक द पब्लिक द फूड इंक्लूडिंग और ऑनरेबल जजेस so unfortunately I mean your book, as you kept on claiming, is not actually on Ayodhya. It's just a part of it. Unfortunately, आज हम लोग mostly उसी चीज को. I had a large number of other questions on other chapters, but unfortunately we cannot take them क्योंकि काफी time गुजर गया. And I would recommend the others to actually go through your work. सिर्फ अयोध्या ही नहीं डील किया इन्होंने, सरस्वती ही नहीं डील किया इन्होंने. There are other aspects of Archaeological Survey of India, which has been dealt with in the book. Now, let us take a few questions from the public. Mirza Hasnain, considering how Indiana Jones' character in movies and also the Mummy movie series helped to promote archaeology, don't you think South Asia also need more such movies and characters to promote archaeology? Can you suggest some good Indian movies that are about archaeological excavations?
Okay, first of all, there's a misunderstanding. Films like Indiana Jones and Mummy, they do not promote archaeology. They only promote fantasy. तो वो फिल्में देख के एटलीस्ट आर्कियोलॉजी तो ना करें आप. और एज अ फैक्ट स्टूडेंट्स आते हैं दुनिया भर में वही पिक्चर देख के वही फिल्में देख के आर्कियोलॉजी करें, so they are in for a shock. Because these are fantasy films, so they do not, and even for archaeologists like us, we do not believe that they promote archaeology. As a matter of fact, they do disservice to archaeology, because archaeology is a very complicated, complex discipline. It's actually on the other end. It's also, if you're a trained archaeologist, it's a very slow discipline where you have to spend years and years working on a site, unlike what you see in films like Indiana Jones and Mummy. And finally, there isn't any film on Indian archaeology, and thankfully, there aren't many. Yeah, as Shagufta ji points out, guide is a good example. पर अगर guide देके आप archaeology करेंगे तो फिर आप, मेरे विचार से guide में गाने याद अच्छे हैं, वही मैं याद करना चाहता हूँ. And also, but the other problem with let's say a film like what was that film on the Indus, the Harappa, which had Hrithik Roshan in it, Mohenjo-daro, which was like a disgusting interpretation of what a Harappan world is. Although the filmmakers argued that they have taken advices from archaeologists, it's a Bollywood version of Harappan civilization. So I frankly speaking do not think that there are good ways of making films on archaeology. If you're really interested in archaeology, you have to read about it. That is the best way, because archaeology is a discipline which is about practice and then eventually about writing about that practice. So reading is the best way to get into the world of archaeology.
Right. Can we have another question, please? Sir, congratulations for your scholarly accomplishment, especially coining a distinct term, bureaucratic archaeology. Firstly, to what extent discipline of archaeology and anthropology are connected? Secondly, does the archaeological evidence have the potential to create a paradigm shift, in Thomas Kuhn's term, in the knowledge production related to the discipline of history?
So, the relationship between archaeology and anthropology is very uh, clear, in the sense they're both canonical disciplines. They both emerge, the birth of both the disciplines emerges in the history of colonialism, not just of South Asia, but in Africa, South America, everywhere. It is a discipline which is about, both these disciplines is about penetrating the other world. In the case of archaeology, you're penetrating a world which is past. In the case of anthropology, you're penetrating a world which is in the present, but it is close to you. So both of them are, I would argue, very. Their histories are very checkered. Their histories are very complex, and they both their disciplinary discourse are located in very problematic moments of our understanding, which is colonialism. Today, in today's time, the distinction or the conversation between them have become in different. For instance, if you are in America, in both the Americas, in North and South America, and archaeology and anthropology are more strongly intertwined, because again, keep in mind the history of colonialism is that when the New World was discovered, the people, the natives or the indigenous population were constructed, or they were constructed at the other, both by anthropologists and archaeologists. And because there was no distinction between history and present in the New World. And so even that continues even today in American departments. There are very few separate archaeology departments. Archaeology is very much part of anthropology in America, because within the context of American universities, anthropology and archaeology within the context of America is the same discursive framework to understand. But in India and in Europe, because there is in the old world, so as to say, there is a clear distinction between archaeology and anthropology, where archaeology is very specifically the discursive realm if you want to understand past, whereas anthropology is clearly a discursive realm if you want to understand the present, which is other. What I do, or a lot of contemporary anthropologists do today, is that as we do not look at the other. Like, for instance, I'm not interested in going into Adivasi areas to do work, or I'm not going to some exotic location to do work. What I do in this book, or what I've done for 20 years as an anthropologist, is that I use the similar methodology of anthropology that is used when anthropology, we would go into Adivasi areas, into tribal areas, into areas which was outside. I use the same theoretical apparatus, but to investigate our present. And so what I do in this book, in which is why I call it Bureaucratic Archaeology, I use similar methods to look at archaeologists in India, bureaucrats in India, as a tribe, so as to say, as a community in itself. And they function very much like that. And this is just not in India, anywhere in the world. Scientists, the example I gave about labs, scientists inside the lab are outside. We don't have access to them. So what as anthropologists we do, and there is a whole subdiscipline in anthropology, what we call sociology of science studies, where for the last 30 years anthropologists have been entering into these closed areas of our times, like labs, like hospitals, like offices. There's a lot of very interesting work, for instance, emerging in the world when anthropologists are entering into infotech companies. And so the way we conceptualize the contemporary is that there are closed spaces and we have to understand how they function, what is the ideological, political, cultural, sociological elements that play in the way they conduct their work, either in the form of producing archaeological knowledge or in the form of producing capital in the case of infotechnology companies. Now, your second question about archaeological evidence having potential to create paradigm shift in the form of Kuhnian, I don't think so. The paradigm shift is a very specific idea that Kuhn creates in the context of scientific empirical disciplines like chemistry and physics. I don't think so. Archaeology works like empirical disciplines like physics and chemistry. Archaeology is a very complicated discipline because it uses certain empirical methods, but it is profoundly interpretative when it produces knowledge. What I'm trying to do in this book is that I'm arguing that the interpretative mechanism through which Indian archaeologists produce knowledge is fundamentally bureaucratic. So the way the way they work, there are like Wheeler, for instance. Wheeler's methods are, you could say, uh, some kind of an empirical structure that they use to produce empirical work, but the interpretative leaps that they're making is fundamentally bureaucratic. And now, as we have seen in the case of Ayodhya, hugely driven by religious and ideological content. So I don't think archaeology as a discipline anywhere can produce a paradigm shift, because archaeology, unlike other empirical disciplines, is also hugely interpretative.
Right. Can we have the question by Ali Haider? Shubha Khandedkar. Is there an academic body that can effectively challenge ASI's method of knowledge production?
Well, there isn't any academic body, I think, what that can challenge ASI's method. But you know what I'm also trying to argue in this book is that the ASI's method of knowledge production is fundamentally an archaeological disciplinary discourse, right? So I think if we have to start thinking, we have to start, and this is what I have, this is what I think it is so important to study theoretical archaeology. We have to understand how archaeology as a discipline produces knowledge, then see what ASI is doing, or then see what archaeologists in Deccan College or university excavations are doing. But fundamentally, we have to understand how knowledge is produced. Unfortunately, what has happened in universities and Indian archaeology universities, and even where I study, I did my master's. Out of the 16 courses I did over the course of 4 years, there was only one course which was on theoretical archaeology. There were courses on ancient India, architecture, ethnography, and archaeological methods, but only one course on archaeological theory. And I think what is important is that we have to think theoretically about archaeology generally, and then very specifically what is happening in India. And this book is a step in that direction. Is that if we have to think about method, we have to before that think about theory, right? Because in the context of India, we have seen archaeology. Archaeology is not a new discipline. It's been here for nearly more than 150, 60 years. It's a discipline with very, very, very deep methodological processes. It's a discipline which has a huge political repercussion. Right now we are just talking about archaeologists who are trained in universities or who are working in Archaeological Survey of India. I don't know how many of you follow the world of amateur Indologists and archaeologists on Twitter and social media, if you start reading their interpretation, I think the ASR archaeologists that I'm critiquing, they themselves would be digging in their graves, right? So we are in a world right now, in a world which is monumentally problematic in the context of India, where even people who would consider themselves as Hindutva archaeologists would feel that their narrative is slowly slipping under their feet, because you have extraordinary orthodox or fundamentalist non-archaeologist, amateur archaeologist on Twitter with followers of more than 100,000 or million people who listen to them, what they have to say, right? And so we are in a very, very, and I'm going to use the term, messy epistemic world. And what I'm trying to show in my book is just a very small part of that mess, which is a state, right? The moment you get out of the state, it is a free for all. I mean, I would just invite all of you to just spend some time going on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and just look for some of these archaeological Indologists. And I can assure you, if you're a trained archaeologist, whatever be your ideological affiliation, you will be pulling your hair.
The point right. In fact, recently joined a Facebook group of Indian archaeologists. I thought that I would be gaining something and I would come to know. I mean, I was actually exasperated, and those luminaries about whom we discussed today, starting with Ayodhya archaeology, Ramayana archaeology, and Mahabharata archaeology, they appear to be, I mean, angels as compared to the and all of them. I checked some of their people who they are. They are not amateurs. I mean, they are well-established people. In fact, I mean, there is a group led by a very famous person with whom you have also studied, Shindeji. And the type of lectures, the type of things which they are commenting. I am so sorry. I am not an archaeologist in no sense of the term, but I have read something on it, and I mean, Twitter is much worse than what is happening on the Facebook. I think there are a large number of questions. Last we would take, and then we would sum it up. Britishers did contribute to. No, what was the question? Britishers did great contributions to archaeology in India, like Sir John Marshall did excavations of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. Do we find such examples of great archaeologists from medieval times in India during Delhi Sultanate and Mughal period?
Okay, so here you're making a category mistake, which is important. The important thing about Mohenjo-daro and Harappa is that they were 4,000-year-old, 5,000-year-old sites which were buried under the earth. Therefore, you had to excavate, right? They were buried. That's the important. That's the reason you would excavate something which has been buried, right? But in the case of Sultanate and Mughal period sites, most monumental sites are there in the full view. They do not require archaeological excavation because they are there monumentally. What is missing, and I think that, and you're right, there isn't any work, is that there isn't work done on settlement sites of the Sultanate and Mughal period. There aren't large excavation that has been done. Most excavations are, even now within the context of historical archaeology, is fixated on the monument, on the monumental. There are, and I think what is necessary for instance, in the case of the medieval period, in the Muslim medieval period, is that we really don't know how, for instance, the non-royal lived. We have very little evidence of that, right? In the sense that we don't know how the किस तरीके से प्रजा रहती थी उनके गांव कैसे थे, उनके घर कैसे थे. Very little evidence, or very little excavation work has been done on that. And there is probably a reason, because most of these settlements are still continues to be thriving cities in today's time. Places like, you can Agra or Mathura or Banaras, you can just name it, the whole of North India, Lahore, Delhi. These were sites. For example, if it will be interesting to see, if if you excavate Chandni Chowk, for instance, what kind of settlement pattern we find. But unfortunately, it is fairly impossible to do that, because of the present. There is a living population that exists. So yeah, to answer your question, no, there hasn't been any remarkable archaeological excavation work done of the Sultanate and the Mughal period.
Ali Haidarji, I would beg to differ a little from what Ashish has just said. There are certain works which have been done. For example, M.J. Mehta did some work on Champaner. In Gujarat, for example, this whole concept of medieval archaeology started from there. And then by 1950s, possibly around 1956-58, at the Center for Advanced Study, Department of History, Aligarh, we started with an archaeological section, which carried out certain very major excavations. For example, during the period of Prime Ministership of Indira Gandhi, when at a time Professor Nurul Hassan was the education minister, two national projects were started. One on excavating Hampi, the capital of the Vijayanagar Empire, and the second, Fatehpur Sikri. Around 7 or 8 books so far have been published on various aspects of the excavations and archaeological and architectural material on Hampi itself. Then Fatehpur Sikri excavations, unfortunately, although they were carried out by a joint team of Archaeological Survey of India and Aligarh team led by Professor R.C. Gaur, unfortunately, as we were discussing the non-publication of reports, the ASI never came up with the report of the Fatehpur Sikri excavations, although very insightful things were found from there. The Aligarh team also lacked, after all, they were also archaeologists trained by the same Archaeological Survey of India. But ultimately, by the end of his life, Gaur Saab did attempt to publish his report, a very half-baked report, because at that time he was unable to write himself, so he took the help of some others. But some sort of a report came, which is there, which is now published. And then, of course, we have a number of people who have worked on Tughlaqabad archaeology, taking the help of the satellite photographs and imagery from there and trying to interpret. So there are, it's a new field which is developing. So possibly, as Ashish did point out, that this is something on which not much work has been done. Some work has already been done. Unfortunately, it has not gained popularity as much as it should have. R.C. Gaur, who excavated Fatehpur Sikri, he was one of the directors of that excavation, also excavated Atranji Kheda. The medieval layers, the report of the medieval layers of Atranji Kheda, had it come out, it would have been a very voluminous report, because till date, in my department, we have those things which were excavated out. They are voluminous. But unfortunately, Indian archaeologists think that going back to Harappa is much more important than looking at things which are more closer in time. तो ये मिडिवल पीरियड तो बच्चों का खेल है, एज आशीष सेड कि ये तो खोदना थोड़ी है, ये तो डिब्री क्लीनिंग है, तो इससे थोड़ी रेपुटेशन बनने जा रही है. So all that material of Atranji Khera by a person, R.C. Gore, who did contribute to medieval archaeology, is all gone. Iqtidar Alam Khan, another name, a historian. But he went on to explore, not actually excavations, again debris cleaning, but indigo vats. I have also done. Tried to at Jalali, Iqtidar Alam Khan did at Bayana, Khurja, and certain other places. And he has written the paper. I have also written the paper. लेकिन उसके ऊपर कोई काम, you can say that University of Baroda से ये काम शुरू हुआ था और अलीगढ़ तक वो आके कन्फाइन होकर रह गया. थोड़ा बहुत तुगलकाबाद पे लंदन में बैठ के एक हस्बैंड वाइफ की टीम ने थोड़ा बहुत काम किया, इसके अलावा नहीं किया. Discussion can go on and on and on. It is now 2 hours and we have to stop somewhere. So although I see a question before you, but I would say kabhi aur hum log we will deal with that. Let me thank Ashish that he agreed to come. One of the reasons जो मैंने आज का डिस्कशन रखवाया, ये रखवाया, वो सिर्फ ये था कि आशीष technically speaking is not a historian. He is an archaeologist oblique anthropologist. और शायद इसीलिए इनकी किताब बहुत ज्यादा हिस्ट्री के स्टूडेंट्स में शायद पॉपुलर नहीं थी. My attempt today was कि किसी सूरत से पब्लिक तक, क्योंकि आशीष जी ये प्रोग्राम अभी जितने भी लोग देख रहे हो ये लिमिटेड है, लेकिन क्योंकि ये लाइव यूट्यूब पे जाता है और वहाँ रहता है, तो you would see that within a period of a few days there would be hundreds, even thousands of people who would be watching it throughout the world. इसीलिए हम लोगों ने रखा कि ताकि ये नॉलेज जो आज आपने अपनी किताब में समझ रखी है, आई फाउंड इट एक्सेलेंट, वो पब्लिक तक ज्यादा पहुंच सके और लोग समझ सके कि जो एएसआई जिसके बारे में हम लोग पढ़ते हैं और जनरल कनिंघम और मॉर्टिमर व्हीलर और उसने एंकोर वॉट को ये किया और फला जगह ये किया, लेकिन उसकी हकीकत क्या है, यहाँ पे कैसे पॉलिटिक्स में उसने हमारे हिस्ट्री को जो आज थोड़ा मरोड़ा जा रहा है, how it has contributed to that. I'm sorry, but that is the real fact. Ashish ji, there is another aspect of Archaeological Survey of India, which naturally your book doesn't cover. आपने तो सिर्फ उसके आर्कियोलॉजिकल एस्पेक्ट को टेक अप किया, लेकिन क्योंकि एएसआई पे ही आपकी किताब बेस्ड है आर्कियोलॉजी के पार्ट पे, तो एएसआई के कुछ और काम भी है, कंजर्वेशन एंड प्रिजर्वेशन. जैसे कि आप बात कर रहे हैं कि इन्होंने आर्कियोलॉजी को, एक्सकेवेशन को कैसे पॉलिटिकल टूल में तब्दील कर दिया है, आई थिंक a same type of a book is needed on the other aspects of archaeological survey. I am referring to the major conservation works which have been done on Indian monuments. For example, Humayun's tomb, or for that matter, the entire area of Sundar Nasari. The tombs of Golconda and Bijapur. There were also attempts to take up the Taj Mahal. Unfortunately for them and fortunately for us, that did not take place. But then another attempt was made कि ASI के पास पैसा नहीं है, so let us give it to certain industrial houses. Agra Fort belongs to this place and Delhi fort belongs to that place, and they will look after that. Hmm. So how the monuments of the past, they are also being politicized, जहाँ conservation was needed. There is a very basic book by Sir John Marshall. अभी किसी साहब ने क्वेश्चन में सर जॉन मार्शल का नाम लिया था. That is why I was reminded. He has a book on the conservation and preservation of monuments, which was published long time in around 1905 to 1909. Something मैं इस वक्त उसकी date actually भूल रहा हूँ. That is supposed to be the Bible of conservation. जिसमें कंजर्वेशन से मुराद सिर्फ इतनी सी है कि फर्दर डिके से रोका जा सके. खूबसूरत बनाना काम एएसआई का नहीं है. जितना डिके हो चुकी है उसको वहीं पे अरेस्ट कर लेने का नाम कंजर्वेशन है, जहां तक इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट का सवाल है. अब इजिप्ट में क्या हो रहा है, ऑटोमन टर्की में क्या हो रहा है, और यूरोप के किसी मुल्क में क्या हो रहा है, आई एम डिसकंसर्न्ड. जो यहाँ अभी आशीष ने बताया कि 150 और प्लस लॉन्ग ईयर्स जब से एएसआई और ये पूरा सिस्टम यहाँ चला आ रहा है, तो एक जो उसमें एक तरीका आया है हिंदुस्तान के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में, वो ये है कि आप उसको वहीं पे रोक दें जहां तक गड़बड़ हुई है. उसको अपने आंखों, व्हाट इज ब्यूटी? ब्यूटी लाइज ओनली इन द आईज ऑफ द बिहोल्डर. आपने वहां बड़ा खूबसूरत आपने गार्डन बना दिया जो यूरोपियन गार्डन है, अच्छा लग रहा है, बट नॉट द ओरिजिनल. नॉट द ओरिजिनल. इट वाज नेवर द कंसेप्ट अंडर द मोडर्निज्म. फॉर एग्जांपल, आपने उसके सरफेस को बड़ा खूबसूरत बना दिया, डिजाइन्स को आपने चमका दिया, लेकिन वो डिजाइन जो है वो 20th और 21st सेंचुरी के आर्टिजान की बनाई हुई है, जो 16th सेंचुरी और 17th सेंचुरी के उस मास्टर क्राफ्ट्समैन ने जो बनाया था. नहीं, आप नदीम रिजवी की सूरत देख रहे हैं उस कैमरे से, नदीम रिजवी को नहीं देख रहे. तो आज हुमायूं का मकबरा जो है वो आगा खान ट्रस्ट का मकबरा बन गया है. लेट मी नॉट नेम एनीबॉडी एल्स.
राइट.
So that is another aspect. आशीष जी, आई एम सॉरी, काफी टाइम हो चुका, लेकिन आर्कियोलॉजिकल सर्वे ऑफ इंडिया का एक वो भी काम है which should have taken place. And with these words, I would thank Ashish ji again, and I would request Shagufta ji to make the end comments.
No, I joined in just because I wanted to thank Ashish ji, but also I wanted to apologize to some of you whose questions have not been taken up. And we hope that we will be able to bring Ashish ji back. And there are other things that we can talk about, as you can understand, and you have learned that he's a polymath of sorts. So we will hopefully be talking about other aspects of his work. So I really want to apologize to Giriraj ji, who is also a student and a bureaucrat. And earlier he was working in Atranji Kheda and Fatehpur Sikri during the excavations. I want to apologize to a whole lot of you, Shankar ji, Purnima ji, and everyone, Vijay ji, whoever's questions I've not been able to take up. But please be assured that we will be very happy to have you back. And thank you so much for your participation. And thank you Ashish ji for coming. And अच्छा, ये एक सवाल है जो हमें अभी मोबाइल पर किसी ने भेजा है. वो पूछ रहे हैं कि आपकी फिल्में बड़ी मुश्किल से दिखती हैं और बहुत मुश्किल से हमको समझ में आती हैं, तो हम इनको कैसे एक्सेस करें?
अभी हाँ, मेरी फिल्में डिफिकल्ट हैं देखने के लिए भी. अभी आजकल आई मीन इट्स डिफिकल्ट टू वॉच देम बिकॉज दे आर नॉट इजीली एक्सेसिबल अभी. पर देयर इज अ ऑनलाइन प्लेटफॉर्म कॉल्ड म्यूबी, MUBI. So they are doing a retrospective of my film. So if you want, you can watch them now. And difficult to understand वो तो फिर आप that will require another meeting of sorts to figure it out.
I think that calls for another Ganga Jamuni Asha session, and we could do that.
एक लास्ट में बस आशीष जी आपसे ये कह दूं कि किसी ने आपसे पूछा भी था कि कोई फिल्म है कि नहीं है. तो आई थिंक आपके पास दोनों हुनर हैं, आर्कियोलॉजिस्ट भी हैं, एथनोग्राफर भी हैं, आप एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट भी हैं और फिल्में भी बनाते हैं. So should we expect one film on such topics from you in future?
I don't know. I don't know.
वो बर्गमन की तरह बहुत स्लो होगी सर. बहरहाल मैं सबको ये बोलना चाहूँगी कि आशीष जी की बुक अमेज़न पे अवेलेबल है. थोड़ी सी महंगी है फॉर स्टूडेंट्स, बट आप लोग अपने स्कूल कॉलेज में बोलिए, अपनी यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में बोलिए कि वो स्कूल और कॉलेज यूनिवर्सिटी लाइब्रेरीज में एक्वायर करें. तो ये है बुक ब्यूरोक्रेटिक आर्कियोलॉजी, एंड एज आई सेड इट्स अवेलेबल ऑन अमेज़न. इट्स 4,000 रुपीज़ प्लस. प्लीज डू ऑर्डर. एंड ये बहुत ही सच में बहुत एंगेजिंग बुक है जी.
ये आपने जो 4,000 प्लस की बात की, that's probably the Amazon version. The hard copy is just about 800 rupees, 850 rupees. तो Amazon में अगर आप सर्च करेंगे आपको मिल जाएगा. 850 रुपए की हार्ड कॉपी है.
तो देखिए 850 रुपए की किताब है.
850 की मैंने खरीदी है.
850 की है वो. आप वो Amazon में या फ्लिपकार्ट में मिल जाएगी.
जी जी.
तो ये मेरी तरफ से माफी चाहती हूँ कि मैंने आपको बहुत इन्फ्लेटेड जो प्राइस बताया, बट ये 850 की किताब है, तो आप लोग खुद खरीद लीजिए. और स्कूल और कॉलेज और यूनिवर्सिटी लाइब्रेरीज को भी बोलिए खरीदने के लिए.
पढ़िए.
थैंक यू सो मच. जी पढ़िए, जरूरी वो है. हाँ. ऑल राइट. Thank you so much, sir. So, do you want to announce for the talk for the next weekend?
Friends, we have a number of speakers lined up in future with certain very good topics for the next week. Let me just announce that next week we are going to have Shraddha Kambojkar. Shraddha ji, Professor Shraddha Kambojkar is a professor in University of Pune, and she will be speaking on the representation of the Marathas in certain movies which have been made in India on that particular topic. Apart from that, this will be on 19th of February. 26 फरवरी को Ashugupta ji did not announce, but I would announce it, that Ganga Jamni would be organizing a visit, a tour to Fatehpur Sikri.
So can we call it a study tour?
It is a study tour because there, instead of appearing on the YouTube and Facebook and giving a lecture, I would be accompanying all those who go there and would be delivering lectures on the site, at the monuments. Number one. Number two, the importance of this trip would be that we would be taking all those who are accompanying us, one, to the palace complex, जहाँ हर tourist जाता है. लेकिन I would be telling you about what is written in the sources about it, not what the tourist guides tell you. Number one. Number two, we would be visiting, जो आज हम discussion कर रहे थे, excavations. A large number of excavations have taken place, जो लोगों को नहीं मालूम है. आज आशीष जी ने कहा था कि पेडेबल साइट्स कोई खास काम नहीं हुआ है, बहुत काम हुआ है, हम आप देखते नहीं. तो मेरी अटेम्प्ट ये होगी कि जो इंटरेस्टेड हो जाने के लिए, जाहिर है कि वो खंडार टूटे फूटे चीजें सबको पसंद नहीं आती, लेकिन आई वुड बी ट्राइंग टू शो लार्ज नंबर ऑफ थिंग्स फ्रॉम नोबल्स हाउसेस, हाउ पीपल अपार्ट फ्रॉम द इंपीरियल अथॉरिटी, कॉमन मैन कैसे रहता था, नोबल कैसे रहता था, उसकी दुकानें कैसी थी, कैसे सामान बेचता था, तिजारत कैसे चलती थी, हमाम्स कैसे होते थे, बाजार्स कैसे होते थे. These are some of the aspects which we would be looking at Fatehpur Sikri.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for informing this. So this is on the 26th, which is a Saturday, and there's an overnight stay at Fatehpur Sikri. And for those of you who are interested, please get in touch with me. I am going to add my email address and my number for you. Just to let you know that on the 26th, we will discuss the plan with you, but we will be going to Sikri, staying there in Fatehpur Sikri, and then we will be looking at not just the touristic part but also a whole lot of other things, the village, and just the whole topography, landscape, everything we're looking at. And it, it's going to go beyond what sir has written in his book. And there are some other things as well which we will be adding to this. So there's music and there's padhai likhai. So please do let me know in case you're interested. And this is, as I said, on the 26th of February. Thank you, everyone. Have a very good night. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ashish ji, for joining us.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.